So welcome back, everybody. A very short break there, but I hope you managed to go and grab yourself a coffee, or maybe even try out the networking part of the platform that we have available. But welcome back anyway. Now to this the second plenary session that we have taking place today. So just wanted to quickly run through the remainder of the day that we have going on. So very shortly, as I mentioned, we are going to have our second plenary session, which is going to be focusing on the CBRS band. So we're continuing the theme of looking at key mid-band frequencies, and we're going to be looking at the CBRS band and the shape of the emerging new ecosystem that's developing in that band. Following that, we then have our 3 showcase sessions. So if you add 5 minutes onto all the timings that we have on the program here, we are running about 5 minutes late. So it'll be about 12:15 in Eastern time. We're going to have our 3 showcase sessions. The 3 sessions we have running today, we have a session hosted by Ericsson. We'll be on showcase stage 1, focusing on the impact of 5G on consumers, businesses, and the nation. Showcase stage 2, we have Federated Wireless hosting that, and that's going to be focusing on something that we looked at obviously in the last session. So bringing spectrum sharing to the 6 gigahertz band. And finally, on showcase stage 3, we have a session hosted by NTIA, which is going to be looking at spectrum sharing and the race to 5G, and looking at lessons learned and the emerging frameworks. But as I said, before all of that, we're delighted now to have our second plenary session of the day, focusing on one of the key mid-band frequencies, and the frequency we're going to be looking at is the CBRS band. So without further ado, I would like to now bring to the stage Rob Yates from LYA. Welcome, Rob. So I know you're going to be moderating the panel, and first of all, you're going to be giving us a brief introduction of some of the issues. So looking forward to it, and over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Dan, and definitely looking forward to an interesting session. It's not just one of the frequencies in the midband. Right now, it's the frequency in the midband, so we should have a good chat on that. So if we could bring the slides up, I guess we can get started. So what I thought I'd do, so I'll just set the stage a bit. Now, some of the points we have that I'll make are, will be reflected by the various panelists. So, I'll just try to set the stage. We'll do that fairly quickly, and then I'll let obviously the panelists are the ones that you need to be listening to, but I'll set the stage a little bit. So if you go to the next slide. As Dan mentioned, the timing is a bit different. So we're going to talk about CBRS, the shape of the emerging new ecosystem, 10:55, or we're starting a bit late, so we'll go to about 12:15 likely, and we'll hopefully have a good discussion with the questions from the audience. So we have a very stellar panel, and we'll come back to them, but I'll put the 4 names here. This will be in order of appearance. Derek Klopman from the NTIA, important at the policy level. So we'll start with 2 governmental speakers, and then we have 2 industry speakers. So Derek is NTI, which is obviously the policy advice. Before the FCC gets to run auctions, they have to know what they're running. So the NTIA is the one that organizes all the frequencies. Phil Marnick, who I think needs no introduction to anyone, who's a well-known personality in this industry, has been around for a while, and formerly chairman of the RSPG in Europe. Important for our discussion today, because actually I believe Phil was chair of RSPG when the 3.5 range was identified as a pioneer band for 5G. So congratulations to Phil on that, and to his recent award. We'll come back to these, and we'll hear from each of these speakers. Jennifer and Dave, clearly important stakeholders in the industry relating to CBRS as SaaS providers and as interveners in the whole conversation. Jennifer at Federated Wireless, Dave, president of CBRS Alliance. So a stellar panel and lots to talk about. So if you could move to the next chart. We'll obviously come back to the panel. So I'll just make sure we all know what we're referring to, just a bit of jargon, so we go through things not in any depth, but just to get on the same page, basically. So CBRS, what do we mean by that? CBRS is the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, a name that was concocted, I think, probably back in 2012 or so, perhaps earlier than that, to cover the 3550 to 3700 megahertz range. It's a tiered access band, so you have 3 layers of users in the band. This was done in order to accommodate federal users, primarily which are referred to here as Tier 1, so federal users that have priority rights to use the band for their applications. The most notable one probably being radar systems from aircraft carriers. So they have priority access over all other users in the band. So when we're talking about FCC's auction that took place in July, August, auction 105, we're talking about the PALs, so the tier 2 priority access. So priority access users are this like licensed spectrum, but subject to the tier 1s. The tier 1s can bump you off, basically. You have to put it in simplistically. And then there's a tier 3. So the band was also set up to provide a sort of a dynamic sharing between sort of general authorized access, so similar licensed by rule, as it's called, similar to Wi-Fi, but with more rules around it relative to what you can do and assigned by the spectrum access systems. So we talk a lot about the auction. That's the tier 2, the PALs as we know them. So just in terms of jargon, just so we all know what we're talking about, CBRS, tiered access model, and PALs that go with FCC auction 105. So if we go to the next chart. So why is it important? It's important, and I'm sure Phil can give us a lot more insight on this globally, and all of us have a view of this, but we've got a migration both in terms of users making more use of frequencies, so doing more things, but also ecosystems. So when you go from one generation to the next in the wireless world, you've got an existing set of users on one generation, and you need new frequencies for another generation, and you also need new capacity. So the 3500 range is the key midband focus for 5G globally, and something that all countries are looking at around the world, and in many cases have licensed or by auction or other means in order to facilitate growth of 5G in this range. So it's really, really important. Now, this is not to say there's obviously lots and lots of other bands that can be used for 5G. These were kind of the 3 sort of pioneer ranges, if you will, that were identified for 5G, with the idea that each operator would need in the range of 100 megahertz in the midband. So the US, if we go to the next chart, actually, we'll see it. The next slide. Yeah, so the status, I think it's worth noting in the US, if we look at the range, the overall range, here you've got the positioning of the various bands around the, sort of in a global context. So you have the band 48, which is the subject of auction 105, which also spills over into the general access portion. So you can see the auction 105 was 100 megahertz, but there's actually the other 50, which is general access. And then you've got the broader range from 3.3 to 4.2, which effectively region 2, so the Americas international table, gets translated as 3GPP band N77, so the 5G band 77. So you can see clearly the sort of dynamic here for CBRS, kind of in the middle there, the US band 48, fitting in the broader 3.4, 3.8 range, which also then subsequently fits into the broader 5G strategy around the 3.3 to 4.2. So we go to the next slide. And some of the speakers will come back to this, I'm sure. I think Dave has some charts on this at the end as well. Auction 105 attracted a fair amount of interest. $4.5 billion was a reasonable estimate of where the auction would end, is around there, and I think that played out. 86% of it accounted for by the top 5 bidders, which is not terribly unusual. Verizon being the biggest one. Big cable obviously played a big role here in CBRS, and as we know, a lot of the cable companies have been active in testing in GAA and looking at this band as a way to augment capacity. Average price 21.69 cents, which actually fits in well with international benchmarks. If we go to the next chart, I'll just, in the interest of time, I'll show you that. This is sort of a compilation of auction results around the world. For not all of them, but a selection of them, of the 3.5 range. And it's quite interesting to see that the US result here, even though it has this tiered access model and it's shared, it kind of, in a sense, proves in for the, at the range of the similar range to international benchmarks, which you can see here. So these are kind of auctions that have taken place since in a sense, since the 5G era started for this band. So let's go to the next chart. This will be a lot of numbers, but you kind of get a sense of where it is. So three or four themes here on what we may expect to hopefully talk to with, and we'll get some questions around these. Actually, the sharing regime is an important thematic area for this band. The deployment aspects of GAAs and PALs, and I'm sure that too, Jennifer and Dave should have some good insight for us on that. other implications of the PAL auction in terms of secondary markets and relationship with GAs and end users and things. And then, of course, importantly, the global ecosystem, where hopefully we can, between Derek and Phil and the rest, we'll all talk, and Dave particularly, on devices, is where is the ecosystem headed and how does this all fit together? So that's kind of our setting the stage point, and we can come back to these points, or we can take questions from the audience on it. So if we go through the panel again, we'll start with Derek, and then Phil, Jennifer, and Dave. Derek, Senior Advisor, Office of the Assistant Secretary at the NTIA. Let me hand it over to you.
Thank you, Rob. I greatly appreciate it. I really look forward to our discussion today, and this event is fabulous as usual. It's become a regular staple on the calendar, and congratulations to the organizers. We've heard a lot this week about a lot of different bands. We've actually had a pretty good preview even on CBRS, largely consensus around CBRS as a model for shared access to spectrum. And of course, this is really true. And I think what's really terrific too is the broad and diverse representation that has been telling the CBRS story. So this is across the ecosystem, across the industry, the different players, as well as government representatives. We're hearing a lot of different perspectives, but ultimately there seems to be a real common theme of how collaboration made it work. Collaboration in getting to the solutions, both technical and policy. And really the result is bearing fruit as we see the market opportunity that's being created, and as well as preserving an important federal government mission. Just a little bit of the NTIA perspective here. And so the most tuning in certainly know about NTIA and our role, but for any who do not, kind of boils down to wearing a couple of hats in the spectrum area. First, at the high level, NTIA is by statute the principal advisor to the president on telecommunications and information policies. So we are really the telecom arm or the executive branch. And sitting in the Department of Commerce, we look to promote policies that foster economic expansion and opportunities that drive commerce, supporting U.S. businesses and job creation. We then have the statutory responsibility to manage the federal government's use of the radio spectrum. So we sort of think of us as co-spectrum regulators in the U.S. with the FCC, a bifurcated system in which the FCC manages non-federal spectrum use. So everything from commercial to private, and also state and local government, including public safety. And then NTIA manages the federal side. We handle this through our Office of Spectrum Management, OSM, and OSM gets support from our Institute for Telecommunication Services, or ITS, NTIA scientific and research arm in Boulder, Colorado, which ITS works to advance the state of the art in spectrum sharing, propagation modeling, and RF measurements. The CBRS band, as we know it, is the product of years of work on developing and testing dynamic spectrum access systems. But the reality is that it almost didn't happen. The initial view when we started to look at the band was that sharing amongst U.S. military radar systems and commercial wireless systems might be feasible, but it wouldn't be the case in coastal areas, which of course include many of the largest U.S. cities and population areas. And again, because these are shipborne radars primarily. So the initial recommendation was for the traditional hard static exclusion zones in the coastal areas. And the problem here was that this approach would essentially render CBRS, impossible as a nationwide service, and and thwart the ecosystem development that goes along with it, really destroy the economic case. So we knew we needed a better solution. Technical experts got to work, and the first thing they did was, in working with the Department of Defense, of course, as the incumbent, was to rework the models and redraw the exclusion zones. And it got a lot better. You saw the lines get a little smaller, but it still wasn't really enough. And this is when we then moved to this idea of these dynamic protection areas, or DPAs, that we now have. And this moving away from static exclusion zones to more of a dynamic model, when DoD, we were able to actually see what DoD is not using the frequencies, really was a game changer. And this, of course, includes taking advantage of the environmental sensing capabilities to detect when the radar is in operation. And I know some of my colleagues on the panel here will talk about that as well. So NTIA, led by our ITS experts, followed up with industry, and working with stakeholders, including the Wind Forum standards body, the commission staff, to work out the parameters for testing and certification of the ESC as well as the spectrum access systems. And this collective effort had paved the way for CBRS implementation that we see rolling out today. So the CBRS approach, as experimental and new as it is, represents real progress in advancing what at NTIA we believe is a much needed exploration of real-time automated spectrum sharing approaches. I think it's also a clear example of what our agencies can do together based on data and engineering, that oftentimes occurs below the surface, if you will, of the political levels. It was really the engineers that executed on this and made it possible. Post CBRS, at NTIA, we always continue to look at clearing bands when it's feasible to do so without fostering undue delays or jeopardizing mission-critical federal operations. Realistically, of course, the ability to relocate in a timely and cost-effective way is not always there. Increasingly, we need to look at sharing solutions to rapidly free up spectrum access for non-federal users. So the 3450 to 3550 megahertz bands come up a bit this week as well. It's a perfect example. If we were going to, wait to relocate all the incumbent federal users out of the band, it'd be a very long time before we could make it available to industry. So instead, it will be shared. But working with DoD, the aim is for commercial access to be largely unimpeded across the lower 48 states, and for the commercial operations to operate at, commercially desirable full power levels. And this, I think, is a really big deal. So by taking the sharing route, we could get to an FCC auction as soon as late next year if all goes well. So, with this band, NTIA conducted a lot of initial research to look at the initial feasibility to make this 100 megahertz available. We focused on this 100 of the larger range you hear talked about of 3100 to 3550 because by far it showed the most promise to make it available in the near term. NTIA early this year published a technical report on these findings, and then as all are aware, an expedited process then took off with the White House engagement and DoD to come to a decision by August that yes, we are going to go forward. To be clear, there's a lot of work to do still on this, and we encourage interested stakeholders to engage, including in the FCC rulemaking process that they've launched, and with NTIA and DoD as applicable as well. So back to CBRS. Right now, we're in a support and monitor mode. Leveraging the experience gained from the prior work on both developing the protection thresholds and testing requirements, and then performing the first of its kind conformance testing for the SAS as a new regulatory concept. Engineers within NTIA's OSM and ITS are helping to monitor and troubleshoot any issues as they arrive within the CBRS ecosystem. And this may include examples such as changes to the neighborhood distance for out-of-band emissions, working with DoD to reduce the number of ground-based sites that need protection, targeted monitoring to assess occupancy, and for gathering data on protection requirements. So in a lot of ways, CBRS the story's not over because I think there will be, ways to optimize and even improve the experience further. So I'll just wrap up, conclude these opening remarks. In general, NTIA sees the importance of exploring dynamic spectrum access as a set of tools for sharing. These tools represent not only a means of innovating spectrum management techniques, but they also represent economic viability for future commercial technologies and ongoing U.S. leadership in wireless systems, both commercial and governmental. Thank you.
All right, excellent. It's very interesting, and I actually take all your points on CBRS and innovation and the new approach to it. Just one bracketing point, maybe of interest. You talked about. I looked at I've seen all the documents about exclusion areas and coastal and the evolution of all that. One might have expected in the auction that the coastal areas would have gone, cheap basically, or undemanded. But actually, San Diego, which is one of the most popular places for aircraft carriers, actually had one of the most expensive prices in the auction. So if you want to take a little market view of is this a good idea, it seems like the auction played out. So excellent. So let's move to Phil. And Phil, I think again probably needs no introduction to anyone. Phil Marnick is the group director of Spectrum at Ofcom, and very well known in the industry, and formerly chairman of the RSPG, which is the European group that sets all these standards. So, and as I said earlier, very key in identifying these bands for 5G in the first place. So over to you, Phil.
Thank you very much indeed. And so nice to be able to talk to everybody. It's just a shame that we're having to do it virtually, and I wasn't able to come to DC this year. I was going to briefly talk about the bands and CBRS and where we get to. So we can move to the next slide, please. I think one of the challenges for all of us is not what spectrum bands we should use or what we should do it, is that actually more and more of industry needs to use spectrum. And as we get to go faster 4G and 5G, people really want to have private networks and public networks. So for us, the idea is, how do you make a capability available to enable both people to be able to do what they need to do? So if we move to the next slide. And in our case, what we've been looking at is, we know for very big mobile, we need national licenses. So we auction spectrum for national. We also need local access or shared access, that's spectrum available at the point you need it for whatever your business is, whether this is an enterprise who needs it inside the building or on what people call campuses or business parks, or whatever else. We also need exempt spectrum and light license spectrum that you can use wherever you want to. So for us, it's trying to get the capabilities doing it. We think CBRS is a great way of doing it, because what it does is it overcomes technical problems the US had to enable spectrum that would otherwise be not used to be usable by putting technical capabilities in. In other places, you can draw lines around it, again using DSA or other capabilities to do that. And for us in the UK, we're using all of those capabilities to see how we make spectrum available for people and businesses to be able to use it, and make spectrum available in bands that everyone can use and therefore drive the ecosystem. Because it's no use having a bit of spectrum unless there's devices or systems that can actually use it. So for all of us, it's really important to be able to drive the ecosystem, both in mobile, but also in the enterprise, to enable both solutions to be built. So we move to the next slide. And our way of doing it is a very simplish version of what the CBRS model does. We have two types of spectrum where we got shared. So shared access licenses and shared bands. Basically, you tell us where you want it. We make sure there's no interference. You won't cause interference to others. You pay a small fee, cost-based fee for a channel, and you get a license. We've also looked at places because people are interested in coverage and activations in other places in the really big auctioned mobile bands. So in parts of the country where spectrum is not used, because you don't use some of the high frequencies in some of the sort of very remote rural areas, we've looked at ways of how we can enable people to use that spectrum for some applications as well. For us, it's therefore looking to see whether it works, whether it will not constrain the mobile operator to be able to roll out, because obviously we want to improve mobile coverage everywhere, and then making spectrum available to be able to use it. So for us, it's getting the right balance and the right technical capabilities to enable people to use spectrum at the point they need to in bands they do. If we can go to the next slide. What I thought I'd show you here is, this is the UK's 3.4 to 4.2 gigahertz band plan, which is, as you see, quite a busy bit of spectrum. I'm glad to see that we've now got mobile devices that have come out which actually enable us to use the entire spectrum band. In our case, in the range from effectively 3.4 to 3.8, we've allocated this to mobile and auctioned for national licenses. And we cleared out people who are using it for earth stations and others. So we actually did a clearance program to ensure the spectrum was cleared right across the entire band, from the bottom part of 3.4 to the top part of 3.8, with necessary protections to protect the services on either side. We've already allocated by auction or other allocation methods earlier most of the spectrum, and we've got another 120 megahertz of spectrum which we'll shortly auction to be able to get all of that spectrum out into for national licenses. And like everywhere else, our auctions are open to anyone to take part. The other part of the band, 3.8 to 4.2, we still see that it's really important to maintain C-band satellite services. And we've had fixed links in this band. But we also think that we can make this band available right across the country, with a few exclusion zones and protecting the earth stations we've got, which tend to be in very rural areas, to enable enterprise solutions. So for us, therefore, we enable local licenses in the entire band, 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz, and license at a local level. And we put into place a set of rules that enable two things: inboard solutions at sort of low power, and outdoor solutions which are at medium power, to enable you to deploy base stations, whether you want to do fixed wireless or whether you want to do a bit of mobile activity in a local area. So for us, it's trying to make sure that spectrum's available. It's also important, as was said before, that actually you need to drive ecosystems. And therefore, the more of the world we can have that concentrates its demand for these sort of applications in certain places, the easier it is for everybody to be able to drive devices and make things work. So for us in Europe, we actually said the 3 gigahertz band was our pioneer band for 5G. And therefore we put out the band 3.4 to 3.8. We in the UK looked at the other parts of the band, and we've been working with regulators right across the world to see how we can make the right solutions available. Not saying you must do this, but actually finding ways of which you can have mobile and other services occupying the same bit of spectrum. For me, I think the great thing that CBRS has done, it's given us a lightweight protocol that enables devices at enterprise level to talk to databases to enable automated authorization. Those are tools that you can use. They're not tools you have to use, but they're tools you can use and therefore drive and develop an ecosystem that's both enterprise and outdoor national mobile network. So for me, it's quite important. I think there's an awful lot of lessons all of us can learn from the CBRS experience, but also everyone can learn from different examples around the world so we get better solutions and therefore enable everybody to access the spectrum they need to deliver the services they need to do. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, so hopefully we'll get some questions on some of the other approaches once we get to the question period. Very interesting. Thank you, Phil. And good to see that band plan. And we'll, of course, also look forward to hearing more about that upcoming auction. So next, Jennifer, if she's going to come up there. Welcome. And Jennifer is VP Legal Advocacy. It always sounds a bit scary to me, but obviously a lawyer, legal advocacy at Federated Wireless, a key stakeholder in CBRS as an SAS provider and the SC, I believe, as well. And very important anchor point to the CBRS mission. Jennifer.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the Forum Global people for putting on another excellent show and for including Federated Wireless in this discussion. I'm Jennifer McCarthy, VP of Legal Advocacy for Federated Wireless. You may know us as one of the Spectrum Access System administrators for the CBRS band. We are also a prospective 6 gigahertz automated frequency coordinating administrator, leveraging a lot of the same capability, technology, and lessons learned from CBRS and porting that over to other bands to enable shared access between various services. Given that this panel is focused on CBRS, I want to talk about and focus my discussion on some of the lessons we've learned over the past year in implementing the CBRS sharing framework on a commercial basis. It's been a little over a year now that we've been operating commercially. The industry, I think we've got over 60,000 CBSDs, the majority of which are eNode B, LTE 4G eNode Bs across the country. And those are operating in the GAA tier, the unlicensed but nevertheless managed by the SAS tier. And I just want to make a distinction between typical unlicensed, usually a contention-based protocol arrangement that happens under the FCC's Part 15 rules versus the GAA tier, and what some of those differences are and why we think this is a really unique and interesting approach that the FCC and NTIA have taken with CBRS. While it is unlicensed in that you do not need to participate in an auction to get access to spectrum in the GAA tier, you are managed by the Spectrum Access System, which will make sure that your operations do not interfere with any of the higher tier folks, including the DoD incumbents, as well as fixed satellite earth stations that we're also sharing with, and some grandfathered wireless internet service providers that are transitioning their point-to-multi-point fixed systems over from some older FCC rules to the new CBRS sharing framework. So the SAS makes sure that any of these GAA operations do not interfere with those incumbents, as well as with the priority access licensees who just finished the auction a month and a half ago and are about to receive their licenses shortly from the FCC and will begin operations on that PAL spectrum probably before the end of the year. But the SAS not only works to make sure that the incumbents and the higher tiers are not interfered with, but also manages the interference and amongst the GAA users. And I think that's a lot different from a traditional Part 15 unlicensed or licensed by rule type of regime, where it's a little bit of the wild, wild west, where everyone has to contend for various frequencies, and you may end up experiencing more interference or less deterministic access to spectrum than you would like, particularly for enterprise applications. The advantage of the CBRS GAA band, and again, over 60,000 devices been deployed and operating now in that band, even before the auction was really complete, is that we have more deterministic access because of the SAS's involvement in managing interference amongst the different users and trying to find ways of sharing the spectrum more efficiently. And in addition, you're getting to take advantage of the carrier grade 3GPP technology that is available for this range of frequencies, as Philip was mentioning, and Derek as well. These are higher power levels than you would typically get in an unlicensed band, and we've been discussing the advantages of the ecosystem, and I know Dave is going to talk about this. We've got over 40 vendors that are supplying LTE equipment for this band, and I think it might be the largest equipment ecosystem that exists. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's both PAL, more licensed access for this spectrum in this band, in addition to the GAA tier. And that combination makes it unique and has a lot of advantages for both the folks that are looking to use licensed spectrum, as well as for the GAA tier. So at Federated Wireless, we're really excited to move from the GAA only phase and into the PAL plus GAA phase, and help those PAL licensees to start deploying, as well as helping them with their secondary market opportunities. The FCC has put in some unique rules about allowing a streamlined secondary market process, where the Spectrum Access System Administrator, such as ourselves, can help licensees, PAL licensees, to lease any unused portion of the spectrum in a streamlined fashion, and get sort of same-day approval of those leases, and create what I like to call the Airbnb for spectrum, where people can look rapidly, find out what's available in their area, and get a lease in place and start using that spectrum. If a lease does not occur and there is leftover spectrum, one of the other good parts about the FCC CBRS rules is the use it or share it component, where we as a SAS administrator can assign that spectrum to the GAA tier if a PAL licensee is not using the spectrum. If the PAL licensee does start using it, wants to use it, and starts deployment, we will reassign the GAA users to the GAA portion, or to a different unused portion of a PAL licensee spectrum, and let the PAL licensee whose spectrum it is use it on a priority basis for their operation. Fairly complicated scheme, we know, but what we love about it is there are clear, bright line tests for how we're going to administer this band. And we've got the cloud-based automated dynamic sharing technology up and working. No reports of interference in the commercial year that we've been operating. So we think it's a real success, and look forward to working with folks around the world to try and take advantage of this capability, figure out how to apply it to different bands or different scenarios, and to really maximize access to this spectrum, not only for incumbents, new entrants, but different types of new entrants, whether that's those who need more traditional licensed access versus those who are happy to work with a more unlicensed like tier, such as enterprises, as Phil was mentioning. So thank you very much. I look forward to hearing from the other speakers and going to Q&A.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was great. And I like that analogy with the Airbnb. Maybe Spectrum Airbnb will fare a little better than the actual Airbnb at the moment. As you, with all of us not using Airbnb, sitting at home on our Zoom screens. Excellent. And I also thought it was a very useful clarification for the audience on GAA is a different regime from Wi-Fi, which I said really quickly at the start, but I think Jennifer did an excellent job of explaining it's licensed by rule, but because of other aspects of GAA and the need to run by the SAS, it's not the same thing. It's an important distinction that a lot of people, I don't think, really have a good understanding of, and maybe will better going forward. So on to the next, Dave Wright, again, someone who probably needs little introduction. I should also mention this is a tradition for us now because Dave and Jennifer both on a panel I did last year on CBRS. So we're continuing an important tradition. Dave is president of the CBRS Alliance and a key industry group that works on the device type approvals and specifications and making sure that the whole ecosystem moves forward. So Dave, I'll pass it over to you.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Rob. And my thanks also to Dan, Jordan, the rest of the folks at Forum Global for the invitation for the Alliance to participate. Glad to be back. So I should point out, as Rob just mentioned, I'm speaking here on behalf of the CBRS Alliance. My day job is with CommScope, so just keep that in mind. But these comments will be made on behalf of the Alliance. And I didn't push back on this, but as I thought about the title for this panel and this session, I probably should have a little bit, because I would take exception with the characterization of the ecosystem that I'm representing as being new or emerging. We may not be middle-aged yet, but we're certainly into the young adult or adult stage. We're no longer infants. We've been doing this for a long time, and I think hopefully you'll see that reflected in the slides. Kind of to carry over Tom Power's analogy from earlier, I'm batting cleanup here. A lot of great remarks have been made already. And one of the things that occurred to me as Derek was speaking is my comments are going to be focusing on the commercial industry ecosystem that has formed around the opportunities in CBRS. But the overall, overarching ecosystem for CBRS certainly includes the federal incumbents, which would be DoD, the NTIA interests, and it wouldn't be without the engineering talent at the DoD CIO's office, at NTIA's Office of Spectrum Management. Without their hard work, we certainly wouldn't be where we are today with commercial operation across the band. So next slide, please. And I'm just really going to give you a snapshot again of what a healthy ecosystem looks like. If policymakers and regulators get a framework right, what can happen? So, CBRS Alliance, who are we? We are 184 different companies and organizations that have come together around the opportunities in CBRS. We formed about 4 years ago, August of 2016, with 6 founding members, and we've grown it to this in 4 years. So again, I think that's reflective of the use cases. Philip mentioned how Ofcom is really looking to address the sort of diversity of use cases, both public and private. I think that is certainly reflected here as you look at the names. We've got mobile broadband interest, fixed wireless access, private, which I would characterize as both enterprise and industrial. And then a lot of our parties are also very interested in utilizing CBRS with 3GPP technologies, LTE and 5G NR, to deliver better in-building cellular coverage. So think of this as next generation DAS, maybe DAS at a lower price point, and a lot of properties where DAS doesn't make economic sense. If you look at this ecosystem that's formed around CBRS, I would just point out, we've got 184 members. We've done it in 4 years. If you compare that with the Wi-Fi ecosystem, which is huge, right? We just had the panel on 6 gigahertz. The Wi-Fi Alliance, which has been in existence for, I believe, about 24 years, if you trace it back to the days of the WECA, which is originally the Wireless Ethernet Consortium. So call it 24 years of existence, global harmonized 2.4 and 5 gigahertz opportunity. They've got about 850 members. So I'm really pleased with the fact that we've gone to 184 members in 4 years with a US specific solution. And as more bands are open for not necessarily sharing, maybe local licensing or local access, as Philip talked about, that Ofcom's doing or other countries in Europe are doing. We look forward to seeing this ecosystem continue to broaden and expand. Next slide, please. Another indication of the growth of the ecosystem, the health of the ecosystem, is how the equipment is taking off in the band. Philip made this point as well. You can't have an ecosystem if you don't have equipment. So I would say the equipment availability is certainly a symptom or an indication of how strong the ecosystem is. This is the infrastructure side of things. So these are category A and category B CBSDs, as we call them, in CBRS, which are the base stations. And I would point out, to kind of, again, reiterate another point that Philip made, we're definitely benefiting from global harmonization here. The fact that the 3.4 to 3.8 gigahertz range specifically has been identified as a global LTE TDD band for years and years, a better part of a decade, if I'm not mistaken, is certainly resulted in there being a vibrant hardware ecosystem. Everything from the chipsets to the base station equipment to the clients. And the fact that now those same frequency ranges are identified as 5G pioneer bands, as I think Rob mentioned. Philip had a role in that at RSPG. So that is helping to drive the availability of this equipment, and we're certainly riding that wave. Next slide, please. This is a companion slide basically showing what the client side of the CBRS ecosystem looks like. So as of today, we're at 138 client devices. We've seen very strong and accelerating growth here in the last 3 or 4 months. So we're very pleased with this. The availability of clients and the type of clients really reflects the diversity of the use cases. So we certainly have smartphones, but we've got tablets, we've got laptops, we've got customer prem equipment for the fixed wireless applications. We've got different gateways and modules for IoT type applications, both ruggedized and consumer grade. And then there's some mission specific client devices, things like barcode scanners, security cameras. If you go to the FCC authorization page, or you just go to the CBRS Alliance's certification page, you'll find listings of these different devices. Obviously pleased to see the iPhone 12 has band 48 support. That's not surprising to me. The iPhone 11 has had it for a year, but those are the kinds of things that we're seeing. So very healthy hardware ecosystem available in the band. Next slide, please. So, I just wanted to highlight, one of the things that Jennifer pointed out. We've had commercial availability of the band since last September. We got the initial commercial deployment authorization September of 2019. The photo on the left is a picture from that launch event that we had, and you've got, Commissioner O'Reilly from the FCC, Fred Moorfield from the Department of Defense CIO's office, and then Diane Rinaldo, who was the acting head of NTIA at the time, all on stage. And so again, this is reflecting the industry and federal collaboration, and I certainly agree with the points that Derek made that we have all grown in our mutual understanding of one another's needs. DoD's needs are vastly different than commercial industries, and we've really developed more of a mutual understanding of that, which has led to just a much more collaborative and constructive approach when we've run into issues. And we certainly have run into some pretty good challenging technical issues, but that's where the engineers on both industry and the federal agency sides have really rolled up their sleeves. Jennifer mentioned some of the numbers on CBSD deployments. It's really the range of use cases, indoor, outdoor. I've talked about the equipment on the right. We do have 5 authorized spectrum access systems administrators. I've got about 2,000 certified professional installers. And then it's also worth highlighting that the Alliance back at the beginning of the year released our first technical specifications supporting 5G NR operation in the band. So this is also, to Rob's point, the first band supporting 5G NR, a midband, I should say, pardon me, the first midband spectrum in the US supporting 5G NR. So that is a big milestone for us. One stat that I don't have on the slide, but I wanted to highlight, and Andy Clegg pointed this out on a panel, I think it was Tuesday, that we've had 0 reports of harmful interference to incumbent operations in this year of operation. So that's a good point to note. And I would also just highlight that that means could indicate that we've been a little conservative with protection requirements. I appreciated Derek's comment earlier that one of the nice things about a dynamic coordination regime where you've got databases orchestrating things is that you can go back and do optimizations or tweaks to the rules and to the protection requirements. So we certainly look forward to doing that. And if there's ways we can make even more intensive use of the band while protecting the federal incumbents, we look forward to doing so. Next slide, please. And this is the last one. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I think Rob covered it to a certain degree. We just concluded the PAL auctions. a couple of quotes on the screen, one by Chairman Pai and one by Sasha Javed, who's closely following the auction. And basically, most people thought it would be in the $2 to $4 billion range in terms of the proceeds raised. So just under 4.6. I think it was an outstanding success. I think the range of people who secured licenses or entities who secured licenses is also indicative, again, of the flexibility and diversity of use cases, as well as the ecosystem. Certainly wireless carriers, cable operators, but also utility companies, a lot of smaller wireless internet service providers, some municipalities, just really a host of entities got licenses, and we're looking forward to seeing these put into play soon. And, I would just reiterate what Jennifer said, for those parties who couldn't, bite off the cost of buying a license for 10 years at the county level. We have a robust and a really dynamic secondary market light touch leasing framework that the Commission has implemented for CBRS, and I look forward to seeing that implemented soon. And I think that'll be a way that smaller parties who want to get PAL rights on a more localized basis and for shorter durations will be able to do so. So bottom line, it's a very healthy ecosystem. We really look forward to seeing this grow, and we're eager to share lessons learned, as Philip was talking about, with regulators around the world and in other bands. Thank you.
Great, some excellent data there and good bracketing of some of the points is very important. I noticed just a couple of quickies though on your, the no one expected part about the auction. I think, we fully expected it in that range, and it came in very close to what our estimates were, which we don't typically publish. But there were, I think the 20-cent range was quite reasonable compared to what we'd seen elsewhere, and that's kind of where it came in. Not to say anything negative about other analysts, but. The other interesting thing I thought, Dave, on your charts, this is a quick bracketing too. We have NTIA on the call, but we don't have FCC. But on your, I guess, second last chart, you had the ongoing launch. I believe it was in LA last year, right?
It was in DC actually. We figured, that's where it was birthed. That's where it could have been.
I remember exactly. We were there, but yeah, no. But you had a picture. It was Michael O'Reilly was there, and of course, NTIA did a lot to facilitate the ban, but Michael O'Reilly was the commissioner that was responsible for pushing it for many, many years at the FCC, and who unfortunately will be leaving at the end of the year. So anyway, just a shout out to Michael there, but he was on our panel, I think, last year, right into the panel last year. So yeah, I'm sure we'll all miss Michael O'Reilly from the FCC. So I guess we go to questions. I guess before the questions, though, we did do the poll, the audience poll. I guess one of the key questions here, and it probably, we should probably segue to Phil first on this, but one of the key questions that came up, or discussion points, is the sharing mechanism, which is clearly the innovative part of CBRS in all the ways. The ecosystem is innovative, but the sharing mechanism is what's really new here. And so we asked the audience, right, do you think that dynamic coordination or sharing would provide a good option in other bands? And so interestingly, I guess, and maybe it's a reflection of the audience, but 45% of the audience said yes, it should be applied in the 3450 to 3550 range. Now, interestingly, of course, there is an FCC consultation on that at this very moment. The comments due shortly, so people may not want to say exactly what they're going to say. But my reading of that consultation is that it's not actually focused on using the same sharing mechanism. So maybe we could look at that point. I think some of the other responses we got, 15% said use it in Europe in 3738. Maybe that's a point for Phil on their upcoming auction. 24% said 3.8 to 4.2 in the UK. Interestingly, I don't think we even identified that band, but 12.2, 12.7 is another band. 1% said that. There's obviously one big licensee in that band right now, and maybe that's something of interest. 37 gigahertz, which is not currently used, has a coordination regime. 5% said it should be applied there. And there were no other suggestions. So I guess we captured it pretty well, but maybe that's the first question. So Phil, why don't we start with you on that point? That you said there's other ways of doing this. Your way is slightly different from CBRS. Other countries do different things. What do you think about that?
I think, databases are very useful to be able to manage spectrum, but actually, one of the things we did is it takes time to develop databases and the capabilities. And therefore, what you're trying to do is, how do you get spectrum into the public domain quickly and enable it to be used? And at the end of the day, all you're trying to do is, how do I authorize spectrum? It's the same as the we used to have lots of discussions about TV white spaces and databases. And I used to go to talk to some countries who had no usage whatsoever in the band, but thought to be able to authorize that they needed to wait to develop a database. And you sit there going, why? You can just do it without any particular problems. So I think for me, the databases are a very useful thing to use when it's the solution to the problem, but you shouldn't sit there waiting and think you have to use the database if you don't have the problem the database fixes. The thing you want is to enable people to get access to the spectrum very quickly. I think the question you've got on 3.7 to 3.8 is, if you look in Europe, Germany has particularly reserved 3.7 to 3.8 for enterprise usage, for local licensing. And that was just the approach the Germans took and the way they were looking at it. In the UK, we didn't particularly have that problem because we made other spectrum available for that problem, and therefore have taken that approach. And we've looked at actually making the entire band available for mobile networks. And we happen to have 4 mobile networks, and actually we think we need national coverage for those sort of things. So people are just looking at different bands. And I think it's too easy to get tied up on bands or tied up on parts of bands. What you want is, how do you enable people to use it, and what's the appropriate tool to make that work, given the circumstances you're starting from. And if you've got problems, as the US had with warships going up and down the coast, you need a method to stop it interfering with the warship. If you don't have warships going up and down the coast, you don't need that solution. You need a different solution for the same band. And for me, it's get the right solution for the right problem.
Sure, no, that makes sense. And I guess in North America, or in the US particularly, yeah, the ESC, which kind of protects the aircraft carriers and whatnot, and then there's the SAS, which also includes the GAA. I guess to your point though, on the the development of a database, Derek, you said about, you kind of alluded to the dynamic sharing and used the words real time. I guess, how does that relate to what Phil is saying? Because the SAS is literally real time. It is something that has to be created as a database. Is that something, and related to other bands as well, is that something you could comment on?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting discussion and sort of a transition looking forward. I think, and I think others will agree. As we look at the model from CBRS with the SAS and the ESC, I don't know that we need to make a conclusion yet whether the whole thing gets ported over, but I think we're learning a lot of different things from it that are certainly useful. And when we look at 3450, 3550, you're right. The part of what you're doing is looking at the systems in the band and also the rules that you're doing. And we're, we've learned some here. We're taking some different approaches. We've talked about, enabling things like, more full power access. There's stuff around, DoD's concept of operations and how they may work to accommodate things here a little bit differently. Because again, if they use the band fully, then you wouldn't have the access we needed. Another thing from the NTIA perspective that we're looking into is we have a new project going on, something we're calling the incumbent informing capability, which is, we're calling it the IIC. And one way to think of this IIC is as a complement, or maybe an alternative to some of the sensing mechanism component in CBRS. And rather than just rely on sensing the incumbent, what this does is it would have the federal agency incumbents in this case, provide, an accurate real-time data on their frequency use, their time of use, and the geography to some kind of a secure portal and database. And again, whether that's an SAS exactly or how that works, I think still needs to play out a little bit. So it could be like the SAS, but again, I think we're waiting to see what makes the most sense. I think, we've had some people playing with terminology. Somebody suggested we could just refer to it as the future dynamic emission control system, right? Right. Because the point is you're communicating the conditions for federal use and how to mitigate any harmful interference. There's more work we need to develop this here. Some of the things that we're looking at are, the ability to provide granular data on the federal use to ensure that there's sufficient agility of this system. The need to secure the portal and database mechanisms, right? And then generally establishing confidence at the end of the day that on the part of the commercial users and the agencies that the system will allow full non-federal usage while ensuring we protect the self-reported federal operations. And so we'll see. We've been asked whether this IAC is eventually going to include support for CBRS, and I don't think we know the answer yet, but I certainly think that in that case down the road, it certainly will be a ways out in the future before we would get to that.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, certainly. It's so much more complicated than it sounds. and maybe we should. So why don't we move to Jennifer, because she was nodding a lot on the other band thing, and you also mentioned that you're doing some coordinating work in the 6 gigahertz as well. And maybe we'll segue to question 1 as well. If you could talk about the other bands. Question 1, Jennifer, and maybe to Dave after too. But question 1 we got from the audience. Since CBRS went live, have there been instances where GAA users lost the use of their spectrum for a time because of the priority 1 users? So maybe that was answered partly already, but Jennifer, why don't you talk about other bands in that particular question?
Sure. Yeah. No. We definitely think that the technology and solutions that we've developed for the CBRS band can and should be ported over to other bands, including the list that you went through earlier. Again, the circumstances are not going to be identical to what we've got in 3.55 to 3.7 with the exact same incumbents, but the general principles are all the same. If you know what the incumbent use is, you can determine their operating characteristics, what the potential for interference is, and then manage the sharing and use of this band through a cloud-based computational system. That this is a far more efficient way of making the spectrum available. It can be done in real time, as opposed to taking weeks or months to negotiate with the incumbents or work through the particular nuances of this person wants this spectrum at this time. Again, bright line tests and protection criteria, I think, are really critical to making the use of this band and the sharing mechanism behind the scene kind of seamless. Even looking at what Derek was just talking about with the 3.45 gigahertz band, we think there's a lot of work that we've done in CBRS that could be immediately ported over into that 100 megahertz and make that spectrum available very quickly, maybe even faster than what's currently being planned. And that might include extending the environmental sensing capability sensors. We've already got a network up and running, listening for radars in the CBRS band. It would not take much for us to update the front ends of those sensors to listen for the additional 100 megahertz, and we could start making that spectrum available to new commercial uses, within a matter of a few months. And then if over time we want to start making more extensive use of portal-based informing capability, we can start transitioning from the sensing capability into the notification system as it becomes ready. But in terms of getting immediate access, we think that leveraging the existing CBRS sharing system, the sensors, as well as the SAS for managing the new users, is really going to be the most efficient way of getting that spectrum to market quickly, protecting the incumbents, and then phasing in a new approach. And again, I think these same solutions are great for other bands, whether that's 12 gigahertz, 6 gigahertz, which is going to be a lot simpler because we don't have itinerant incumbents for the most part. Lots of applications that can work.
Okay. Sounds good. And to the specific question, of the GAA question, has anyone been zapped about the Coast Guard or the aircraft carriers? Go ahead, Derek. Sure. You want to answer that?
Yes. So just a quick point on that. I mean, from our understanding, and I don't know, the SAS providers might, we're not aware of any users having move off the spectrum at this point. And part of that, of course, is because you didn't have the PALs aren't in use yet, right? Sure. So if you think about the number of channels, if you had, for example, the radars operating, they're not going to necessarily need all the channels, right? So I think at this point, we haven't seen that happen yet. I believe, to the best of my understanding.
Interesting. So maybe we should give Dave a chance to chime in on that too. And I think you had also mentioned, guys pointed out that San Diego went for a big price, and actually in your chart you had San Diego Gas and Electric and other people in that area. What's your view on that, both on the GAA point and on the other bands?
Yeah, I mean, I think the PAL auction results sort of highlighted the fact that the bidders, were confident that the system is working, right? And if they secure a PAL at auction, or if they secured a license at auction, even in a coastal area, that the combination of the ESCs and the SASs orchestrating everything, they would get their 10 megahertz of license protected access from the SAS. And as Jennifer said, that can involve moving GAA users around in order to free that PAL channel. But that's the beauty of the 3-tier framework, as far as I'm concerned. I was going to loop back real quickly to one of the things that Philip mentioned, which is that Ofcom elected to go with I'm going to call it manual. I don't know if that's the right word, but a non-dynamic approach for the shared local licensing in 3.8 to 4.2, as an initial step. And I think that was absolutely the right thing to do. It gets them to market quicker. And then they're asking some questions now about, will database coordination be helpful in any ways going forward? And I think that that was the right question to ask. I think hopefully we'll see the same kind of robust use and ecosystem form around the opportunity in the UK for 3.8 to 4.2. And at some point, that demand may become problematic with a first come, first served sort of an approach, and a database could be helpful. So, fully agree with that, support that move. And, I would just say that a lot of the work that we're doing in the Alliance doesn't presuppose a sharing framework. It's really about just trying to enable private or neutral host deployments of cellular technologies. These are, we just came out with a private network deployment guides. We've worked with the local cellular numbering administrator here in North America, ADIS, to get a shared HNI or PLMN ID, if you will, as well as the, all the different identifiers you need for the base stations, as well as MC blocks for the subscriber identification, in order to facilitate private deployments, right? This has always been the realm of the mobile operators exclusively up until now, so somebody had to tackle that, and those are the kinds of things that we've been doing at the Alliance, and again, that I think have applicability regardless of whether it's a dynamic or an alternative licensing approach.
Okay, makes sense. So we've got a few minutes left, so we've got a few more questions. I'd like to maybe give whoever wants to answer them a chance to, but two of them are kind of related, so maybe we can deal with them together, or interrelated. So one of them is, what are the thoughts on expanding CBRS methods to 3.45355? So that's what we've just been talking about. But I guess bringing in the other aspects, such as county size versus PEA, or SAS control power level protected. So is that, I guess that's one nuance we haven't really talked about in using different bands. Obviously, the county level licensing in PAL is not going to be the same or it's proposed to be PEA based, in the other portions of the C-band. So on the power control and issues of county size. And then the other sort of related question is whether the new wireless licenses in these bands would interfere with CBRS. So I guess the different technical rules, are the technical rules from the FCC correct in the lower part? But when I say correct, bearing in mind there is a consultation on this point. So I don't know who wants to chime in on that, on those two power levels, lower band interference, county sizes, things like that. Jennifer, you're up for that one.
Sure, happy to chat about that. So, the county versus PEA is not necessarily a technical problem, but I do think the advantage of the smaller license area can be seen in how many participants we had in the PAL auction and how many different license winners there ultimately were. I mean, this was one of the largest auctions from that perspective, and I think we've got over 200 different licensees who were able to get spectrum through that auction, which has never occurred before. And I think that's a result of the smaller license area. We do think that there are going to be technical issues between the CBRS band and the 3.45 band with the different power levels and out-of-band emission requirements. And we are recommending that the FCC reconsider how it ultimately sets up rules for the 3.45 band and maybe revisit the CBRS band. As was mentioned earlier, we've not seen any interference to the incumbents in the past year that we've operated. And, it might be time to revisit the CBRS rules and see if there are ways of optimizing those rules, both for the GAA and PAL users, and to synchronize more efficiently and optimize the band with the adjacent C-band and 3.45 operations. So power levels, out-of-band emission levels, and coordination via stacks, I think, would all be really helpful in terms of maximizing the use of the 3 gigahertz band for 5G systems.
Okay, that makes sense. Phil, do you have any comments on that? I guess the question of power levels across different geographies and things, I mean, not to spend all day on that point, but you have local access and you have national licenses and things like that?
To be honest, I think the power levels one you can have a wonderful academic discussion about for ages.
Right.
I think the challenge is always, like anything else, it's how do you make sure that people don't cause interference? And I think, as Dave said, there's an awful lot of enterprises and other people who want to be able to use spectrum that previously was only available to mobile operators because they're doing different solutions in different places. And they have different applications that you don't really do in a sort of widespread network operator, although you can do it by all this slicing and other things. And I think the challenge, therefore, is how do you make sure you don't interfere with each other? And how do you make sure that some of the synchronization rules that people put in place aren't inhibiting the ability of people to use the application they want? Because the synchronization rules always assume that you're all doing the same up-down link ratio type thing, which may or may not be appropriate for an application you want to do. So I think there's a lot. I think that's one of the things that, as Dave continues the work looking at how enterprises work in this sort of space, it does. I think the other question you've got here on the board, on the US particularly, is as 5G, it works well for an LTE type environment, which is working as its 10 and 20 megahertz channels. How, as you want to use 5G at faster and higher bit rates and everything else and need wider bandwidth, how do you make that capability available in a way that actually enables people to provide a consistent experience?
Sure.
And therefore, I think it's one of the challenges, not power levels, but interference management, as we have all these different applications trying to work together. And I think that will be
you're absolutely right. I see Dave wants to chime in here too. I absolutely correct. In fact, in CBRS it's 10 megahertz. So to aggregate 10 of them to have 100, you've got to coordinate them all. Dave, you've been anxious to jump in on this point.
Yeah, I thought Jennifer and Philip made a number of good points, and I just wanted to highlight the fact that the Alliance, in regard to 3450 to 3550, and how we feel about a neighbor at our southern boundary, if you will, not to the notwithstanding the fact that we've had federal operations that Derek's intimately familiar with down there, the whole time. But I'll just point out that the Alliance, the CBRS Alliance, did send a letter into the FCC, just with some concerns, just some questions that we had about, what. This was before actually the draft FNPRM was circulated for 3450 to 3550. So it was really just based on the initial announcement from the White House and DoD. But based on the power levels that were being discussed and things like that, we just were wondering, if DoD is going to relocate some of their systems out of 3450 to 3550, are those going to come up into 3550 to 3650, which is where we and the PALs are operating, and therefore, we might have more preemption events from the tier one incumbents there. Questions about the informing incumbent capability. I'm still trying to get that one under my sleeve, but is that something that could be applicable into CBRS? I think Jennifer mentioned that as well. And then, Philip just raised a great point, which is the TDD synchronization issues, right? We've got, we're dealing with that within our band amongst the different users of the band. But it could certainly be an issue at the band edge as well, right? So if we've got very high power operations below 3550 butting up against a PAL operation above 3550 or at the 3550 edge, and they're not TDD synchronized, what's the adjacent channel issues that come from that? So I appreciated the chairman's office taking some of the input, I think, from Commissioner Rosenworcel based on her statement at that hearing, where they've included some questions about that. Should there be sort of a holistic approach across the 3 gigahertz range? Because now you've got 3450 to 3550, and it was in your chart actually earlier, Rob, but you got 3450 to 3550 CBRS, and then C-band right above it, right? So what can we do to make the most efficient and intensive use of all of that spectrum?
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And we got one. We'll try to do one more question, which Phil kind of led us to a bit, but it relates also, to the amount of spectrum. But just for the audience too, Dave, I think it's correct to say there's only 2 TDD configurations, right? And as soon as you start using one of them in an area, you basically have to use that one for all the others. Otherwise, you can't synchronize and coordinate things.
There are 2 TDD configs that have been approved or recommended by the Alliance. I mean, there are others that exist, but that's what we're recommending in order to support the variety of use cases.
Okay, so the other question we had, which is actually another really good question, and Phil started us on the topic, but how much CBRS spectrum is going to realistically be made available for 5G? And to me, where the questioner said, it doesn't seem conclusive to free up the large contiguous chunks that are suitable for this. So as I pointed out earlier, the sort of objective of 5G is 100 megahertz in midband. So where does that, how do we get that? And Phil, you don't like that. Okay, what's the story? Let's go start with Phil then.
Sorry, I think you've got to be quite careful of how much spectrum you actually need. I mean, you don't need 100 megahertz. You don't need anything. You need sufficient to be able to enable you to do it. So people over here are providing with 40 megahertz channels and things. It's people are providing services at very fast speeds. I think the question really is, in the States, you've got it in 10 meg chunks. How many 10 meg chunks can you find in a particular area to enable people to do this at any given time?
Okay, well, that makes
no right or wrong answer to it.
Okay, Derek, what's your take on that?
No, I absolutely agree with that. And, I'm certainly not the industry expert on how they put the bands together. But if you think about the way the carriers are aggregating their channels and their blocks and their, the dynamic spectrum sharing within the technologies, I think they can figure this out. And also, including the GAA access, which of course, model operators can employ as well. You will end up, hopefully in the next 2 years with 530 megahertz of contiguous spectrum from 3450 all the way up to 3980. That, there's going to be some differences in how it's deployed and used, but again, that is a large contiguous block when you think about.
Sure, maybe that's going to be the focus for the 100 megahertz. Jennifer, were you going to add the final point on that? You were just adjusting.
No, I agree. I think carrier aggregation is really going to help take care of a lot of the concerns about 5G, and you're going to be seeing 5G deployments starting in 2021 in the CBRS band. So we're working through it.
All right, Dave, any final word on 5G and bands and where things are headed?
As I mentioned, we've got tech specs there. The iPhone 12. Everybody was obviously very interested in what 5G support was in the 12. It doesn't support N48, which is the 3GPP, 5G NR designation for the CBRS band, but it has N77 and N78, which, as you showed earlier, Rob, actually encompasses the CBRS frequency range. So I think it's probably just a matter of tightening up some masks and making sure they can meet the CBRS requirements for out-of-band emissions. And I expect we'll see that in a future model. And I agree with Jennifer. I think we'll see
we'll be looking at next year's iPhone for sure. Anyway, great. As one of our questioners said, great presentations, great panel. Thank you very much, everybody. I think we're kind of hit up against the end of our time. Dan's going to cut us off shortly. So it's been super talking to everybody, and thank you very much. Dan, back to you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut it off. I'm sure we could have carried on that discussion for a long time. Really, really good panel. Really fascinating to hear about what's happening. And I think as a couple of you mentioned, we had a panel on CBRS last year. And I think one of the good things about having an annual event like this, it gives us the chance to see how these things develop, and it definitely has developed quite considerably over the last year. So thank you, everyone. A really, really interesting panel. Thank you very much. So that was our last plenary panel for the day, but we are now moving on to our final showcase sessions. So straight away now, starting almost immediately, we have our 3 showcase sessions running today. So once again, as I mentioned earlier, you can see the different stages in the stages tab, surprisingly, on the left-hand menu bar. So you can either go to showcase stage 1, where we have a session being hosted by Ericsson, which is looking at the impact of 5G on consumers, businesses, and the nation. Showcase Stage 2, focusing on bringing spectrum sharing to the 6 gigahertz band, hosted by Federated Wireless. So Jennifer, who obviously just been speaking in this session now, I'm sure is heading over there now, and she'll be taking part in that one on Showcase Stage 2. And finally, Showcase Stage 3, we have a session looking at spectrum sharing and the race to 5G, so lessons learned and emerging frameworks, and that's hosted by TIA. So please do make your selection there. Don't forget again that all of these sessions, as well as all the plenary sessions, are being recorded. So if there are any that you're not able to attend, and obviously there will be 2 of those that you're not able to attend live, you will be able to watch those again back afterwards, and the recordings will be sent to you as well. But please do now make your way over to the showcase sessions. We'll see you there very shortly. And a reminder tomorrow that we start again back here at 9 o'clock. that's Eastern time, where the focus remains on the midband, and the first session there is going to be looking at the C-band. So we're moving on to look at another key midband there. But thank you again, everybody. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Rob for moderating that session as well. And as I said, head over to the showcases, and we'll see you there very shortly. Thank you very much.